Thank you very much, Minister, Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to be here, and what I try to do over these 2 hours or so we got together is to give an introduction to a different way of looking at economic growth, one that is starting to get a lot of use around the world. It, for example, underpins the emerging smart specialization strategy in the different European countries. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and I will then try to anchor it in the Vietnamese environment, and towards the end I will try to get some key advice on where I think you need to reflect in order to move forward with your ambitious and absolutely desirable objectives. In an audience of this size, I am used to the fact that normally nobody asks questions. So what I expect for you to do instead is to write down any questions you have on a piece of paper, and then you can pass it to the Master of Ceremonies, and I will try to address it in the smaller meeting this afternoon. Right, we'll have the next one, please. So, I'll start with a bigger picture. On about every 70 years or so, there is a dramatic shift in how value creation takes place. You know, now we are in the shift into a digital world. We previously had a shift into an electric world, and before that we have a shift into the things like combustion engines. In all those transitions, which by the way do not happen overnight, they take 20 to 30 years to happen, there are a number of issues facing economies and companies and individuals. The first issue is that there tend to be mismatch between things like regulatory systems and the way things operate. And you can see that, for example, around the world on some of the challenges that different countries have had to deal with Uber as a provider of services compared to traditional taxi companies. You know, the regulatory system was not ready for this, right? There are issues around the education systems. You know, we tend to educate people for a world that has passed rather than a world that is coming. Most countries today, for example, are running a huge deficit in technician-level people with high digital skills. It's not normally the university level that's the problem, it's the next level down. It's the technician level, the vet level, as it's sometimes called. And that is because we don't provide those people. No? You know, there isn't enough people out there to implement the autonomous tractor or to serve it or to do these things. There are lots of people out there who can design them, but there are just not a lot of people to work with putting them in place and maintaining them. So we tend to get in the economy 3 types of companies in those transitions. We get those companies who do not make it, right? They do not adapt to the new world, and as such they tend to die over time, either because of being unaware or because making the wrong decision, the most classical of which is Kodak, of course, or just not being able to implement the right decision. We then have those companies who make the transitions, but in so doing they tend to reduce their number of employees dramatically. So there is a declining employees before they slowly start to grow them again. And then you have new companies which for quite a long time are both small and do not require a lot of people as employees. So the biggest transition change that we are seeing here, and I'll come back to that, is the number of jobs that risk disappearing and may not appear again, even though we will create more jobs afterwards than before, but normally not necessarily in the same place. Right. So in these transitions, it's important to look at what it takes to move forward in a successful way. And one of the things when you look at the Vietnamese economy is a number of challenges. You know, there is a challenge around productivity. There's a challenge around economic growth in this area. And that, of course, is something that needs to be addressed. I have a few quotes here. I'm not going to go through them, but we can agree, generally speaking, that these issues need to be addressed. So, what should you do? Well, that depends very much on the glasses you wear when you look at the problem. And I'm going to be a bit challenging here. Economics is actually not a science. You can kill me afterwards, but it isn't. It's a point of view. You know? And the point of view depends on the assumptions that you make, right? So different economic schools make different assumptions. And hence, the tool they put at your disposal in each of those, the validity of that tool is a function of how your problem context fits the assumptions at school of thinking. And if you look at the macroeconomic schools of thinking, there are 6 of them that make different assumptions and have different toolboxes. And as a consequence, will come up with a different answer to the problem. And I have listed the 6 here. There is the neoclassical economic school, the one you will find dominating in countries like Australia and very prevalent in most Anglo-Saxon countries. There is a neo-Keynesian school of thinking. That is something you tend to find frequently in the Francophone world in Europe. There is a neo-Schumpeterian school of thinking that emphasizes innovation and so, that tends to have quite a role in primarily the part of the Eastern European countries. There is a evolutionary school of thinking, which is one that tends to dominate in the Scandinavian and the Germanic world of the area. There is an institutional thinking, which is the one we're going to spend time on today. And then there is complexity thinking. They all make completely different assumptions. And it's very important to be aware of those assumptions and ask yourself, is my problem context appropriate for these assumptions? If the answer is yes, the theory can probably work and be some helpful. If the answer is no, you are dangerous, really ending up with something that will take you the wrong way. Yep. So, prosperity, what is it? Well, the first thing is that as a country, we need to be prosperous, because prosperity is what enables us to provide all the social and otherwise good that our citizens want. So if we are a poor country, we cannot do that. If we are a prosperous one, we can. So prosperity as an economy is something that is desirable for everybody, right? So what is it that drives prosperity? Well, let me start with a set of very simplified statements. Imagine 2 countries. One country can have the ability to produce all products and services known to mankind, right? And the other one can do nothing, right? Has to import everything. A new technology comes around, hasn't been there before. So this opportunity value of that new technology is different in these 2 economies. In the economy that can do everything, this new technology will enable a lot of new economic opportunities. It will enable that economy to create new companies, do new things, reduce the cost and whatever it is. In the country that can do nothing, this opportunity, this technology provides 0 opportunity. Nothing can happen. And if somebody is entrepreneurial in that country and want to start a company around this new technology, they can't grow it in that country. They have to move somewhere else because they miss all the necessary inputs, the educated people, the raw material, the channels to market. They are no longer there. So the more complex an economy, in other words, the more an economy is able to do, the more opportunities reside in new technologies as they emerge. This is especially critical in this type of value creation paradigm shifts that we are now into, which is the digitalization activities. So let's look at a moment. When we look at countries' prosperity, and academically we can explain about 3/4 of a country's prosperity by linking it to how complex the economy is. And by the way, that is the highest explanatory value of any variable in all the economic sciences when it comes to prosperity, by far. Right? It doesn't explain everything, but it explains a lot. You know? Other things that impact are things like, endowment resources. So have you been given oil? Have you been given minerals? Of course, that will give you an advantage. Has nothing to do with economic complexity, right? If you have good relationships, so you have close relationship, trade relationships give you advantages, or inside the economy, strong relationships of collaboration between large companies and small, that will contribute. Do you have good institutional structures in this area? That will contribute. So, are you trusting the legal system? Are the courts trustworthy? Is the government predictable as opposed to unpredictable? These are very important things. So I have a little graph there, and I'll take the graph. It's from 2010. I have a more modern one from 2014, 2015 when it comes to Vietnam later on. But as a general principle, I like this graph because it allows me to tell a story. So on the axis that goes from left to right, you have economic complexity. Don't worry about the scale. It is what it is. It's just it's something that academics have agreed upon, that it's a scale from -3 to +3. Don't ask me why. That's what it is, okay? So +3 is this country that can do everything. And of course, such a country does not exist in reality. -3 is a country that can do nothing, and it doesn't exist in reality either. But if you look at this scale, you will see that there are some countries up there on around about 2. And they are incredibly complex countries. We have countries like Japan, Switzerland, Germany, Sweden, US. A couple of countries like that are up there, right? Finland being one of them. So these are countries that are very complex. They can do very many things in this area. And then on the other axis, you will find the prosperity value. It's a logarithmic scale of GDP, doesn't matter. And you will find there is quite a strong correlational effect here. You also find 2 colors. It's a blue color and a red color. The red color is made up of countries who have a large amount of endowment resources. So they produce oil or they produce minerals of different types. Whereas the blue one don't have that. So there are a couple of conclusions you can draw already. Firstly, of course, if you have endowment resources, you have higher prosperity on top of your level of complexity. That's to be expected. The other conclusion you draw is that endowment resources countries get lazy. Okay. They don't work on developing their economy, generally speaking. You can see that the most complex endowment economic country is Norway, right? And that is because Norway, as an exception in that group, has had an industry policy to develop its industrial complexity from the day the North Sea oil started to flow. But that's the only one. The third thing we know is that over time, countries will tend to move towards that line. So if you're above the line, you will tend to move down. And if you are below the line, you tend to move up. That means when I looked at Australia in 2011, when I first came to Australia, given a task to work on their industry development, Australia is in the middle, quite high up in red. It's actually the red dot number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 from the right. That is Australia. What I could say at that time was that Australia had 2 choices. They could either drive policy to increase their economic complexity to justify the prosperity they had, or they could accept that their prosperity would decline. Now, how do you see a decline in economic prosperity? What you see is a rapid increasing and prevalent budget deficit, because that means you don't generate enough prosperity to, with your present system, capture the value necessary to maintain the social good that you have as a country. At the time in 2011, Australia had a budget surplus. The decision Australia took was to not increase its economic complexity. Actually, on purpose, it took a decision to decrease it. It kicked out the automotive industry, for example, and a few other things. As a consequence, the net prosperity creation in Australia has declined since then, and actually quite dramatically. And this illustrates how important it is to reflect on economic complexity. I have ringed Vietnam. There is a good and a bad story about Vietnam. The bad story is that you are relatively low in economic complexity. The good story is that you are below the blue line, which means you're likely going to go up in terms of prosperity generation. So, good and bad. And we'll come back to the movement towards the right that you should focus on in a little while. Oh. So, when you look at this, I don't know what a funny picture, but there we go. If you look at these things, you can actually say to yourself, okay, let's look at what countries produce and divide them into groups of complexity. So I divide the complexity of different products, in other words, how much input they need, how many sub-suppliers they need, how difficult they are to make, and so on, into 6 equal parts, okay? They are numbered, number 1, forget the top 100, number 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, they somehow disappeared out on the bottom end there. I'm not sure we can get that in anyway. There should be a 6 on the right, which somehow isn't visible there. Can you see it on yours? Yeah, all right. Yeah, you got it on your scale there anyway. So and if you look at this, you see that complex economies, look at Japan and Germany, they have the majority of their industrial activity in the highly complex products, and very, very little on the ones with low complexity. And I've inserted Vietnam, which was number 98 when I inserted it in ranking, and you can see it has about 2% of its industrial activities in highly complex areas, and the absolute majority, which I think is 60-something, is that on the right-hand side? 60%. Yeah, 60-70% on the lowest complexity issue. And that illustrates the point I made on the previous one, and this is much more modern data. So it shows that there is a challenge for Vietnam to migrate upwards into more complex products in this area. So really strong imperative to do that, because that is the prosperity grounding of the economy is. The more you have on the left, the more you can do tomorrow. The less you have on the left, the less you can do tomorrow. That's a big challenge. So just to put it in perspective, so you don't get fooled by some of these things. So here is what Vietnam exported in 2015. So you can see that's a kind of a percentage of export grouped by complexity and different activities. So at first sight, it looks rather good, right? Because you export a lot of, electronics and manufactured things and so on. So one would say at first sight, without analysis, this is a good thing. Then the analysis comes and you ask questions like, how much of that is done based on domestic R&D? Based on how much is done based on somebody having located production only in the country and then shipping it out? At that point, this does not look so good, right? And that means that you are a price taker on this. So you are totally dependent on the cost of the activities that takes place in Vietnam. The moment your costs are undercut by somebody else, a large chunk of these activities will migrate, because the decisions are not taken by the people who sit here, and they are not taken in Vietnam. They're taken in the headquarters somewhere else of these companies who've decided to temporarily look at these things. And if you want to understand how a company like that operates, I'm going to give you an example. IKEA is a pretty successful Scandinavian company. At least it has its origins in Scandinavia, where it's technically, legally Swiss and Dutch Antilles, but that's a technical issue. They are always looking at the lowest cost for production. And you know they are a very big client of Vietnamese businesses, right? A lot of things that go into the things that people buy in IKEA around the world originate in Vietnam. Every year in a company like IKEA, there is a discussion, is there a cheaper location to make these things where the cost difference are able to absorb the cost of transition from country A to country B? And you know where all those activities were before they came to Vietnam, don't you? They were in China. They left China because China became too expensive, and they left them around the year 2000. Like that, and they're gone. Right? Is Vietnam the lowest cost operation for their activities today? Probably not. Hence, it's a risk. It's a risk that the Philippines, a Bangladesh, a Botswana is going to come up and offer something for part of these operations which make it the right corporate decision to migrate part of those operations to somewhere else. In other words, again, you are not the master of your own destiny. You are a price taker, not a price maker, in that sense. Don't worry, it takes a while. There we go. This is a great picture. Total clarity at one look. This is what is known as product complexity space. So if you look at all products, you can define them on different statistical scales. It goes down to 6 digits, right? This is a 4-digit map. So it's quite defined, quite detailed. And what the assumption, what is this showing? It shows that, it actually shows a map of your competence base, de facto. Because what you produce is a function of what you know, right? So if you can't do something, if you don't have the knowledge, you can't produce it. And if you don't produce very well, in other words, your knowledge isn't very good, you're not going to be successful in exporting it. But if you are very good, then you will be successful in exporting it. So in other words, by looking at trade, I will be able to look at what you are good at doing. And if I compare every single country in the world, I can see who does better than they ought to and who does worse than they ought to, right? That is where we come from places like revealed comparative advantages and other economic terms. So this is a map. Forget the details on it. It's a lot of dots in it. These dots are all the products that exists on a 4-digit scale across the world, right? All the products. If you produce 2 of them, sometimes you will naturally produce a 3rd because they are linked together, competence-wise, right? So I can see that there are clusters here. And by the way, if you look at the right hand of this map, there is like a circular lump on the right-hand side. All of that is textiles. No? And it doesn't show very well, but actually in the real graph that you have on your computer, all of those, thank you, are greenly mapped. So everything with a color is something here where Vietnam has a revealed comparative advantage. And every little dot almost in that lump is green. And that tells me that Vietnam is doing very well in textiles, not surprisingly. Excellent in textiles, right? What you should look at is 2 things there. The first one is it's a lump, and secondly, it has very low linkages to other things in the map. It's a standalone lump almost. That means that if you're very good at textiles, you can make other things in textiles. But it doesn't necessarily make it possible for you to do things that are not textiles, right? And you are very good in textiles, and that means there are some small opportunities to improve that, and we'll come back to that, but it's not going to help you to do a lot of other things, right? So good and bad again. You're very good at it, you should definitely pursue it, and I'll say a few words around it, but the bad news is it doesn't help you to do a lot of other things, right? You will have the same if you go to the bottom. There are a couple of yellow bits down there, yellow and greenish. All of those are food-related activities. So basically low value-added food. So, you know, fresh fish, frozen fish, that kind of stuff. So again, you do well there. It's a color dot, which means you have a revealed comparative advantage in it. You know? So you do that very well. That's excellent. But it doesn't help you to do a lot of other things. It isn't linked competence-wise to anything else. And you can see you outsourcing activities on the left, the lower lump of blue. Again, it's something where you might be able to do more things. You do reasonably well at it at the moment, but it doesn't help you to do enormous amount of other things. Where you want to be is in that lump in the middle. That's where about 4,000 of these things are. So if you're there, it helps you to do other things, right? And if you look, if I had a map here, I don't think I did, I didn't take it up, but if I have a map here of a Germany or a Switzerland or something like that, you will find that they are, the color dots are all in the middle. So they do sophisticated products in the middle, right? And you have a few there, and those are worth building on. But you need more in that area. And the way to think about it is the following. If you look at a given product, you can ask yourself, how many people have the capability of building that product in terms of countries? If the answer is very few, that means it's an extremely sophisticated product, right? Let's take something that's happening here. You're just commissioning a new submarine, okay? It's coming from Russia, right? How many countries in the world can build conventional submarines? The answer is very few. And if you look at those who can build really good conventional submarine, it literally boils down to 4, right? And the reason is that you need an enormous amount of knowledge to build a conventional submarine, actually more than a nuclear, because a conventional submarine is a closed system from an energy point of view, whereas a nuclear submarine is an open system from an energy point of view, which require different issues. It has nothing to do with how well they work. That's not the point. It's the production system of them and what the knowledge it takes. There is about 350,000 components in a conventional submarine, right? In a surface vessel, frigate or something, there's about 25,000. In a tank, there's about 24,000. An armored personnel carrier, there's 23,500. These things are different. There is about 300 suppliers in the total supply chain to building a frigate. There's 1,600 in the total supply chain of building a submarine. This illustrates how much more complex a submarine is, and also why it takes a complex economy to be able to build a submarine, right? Unless you have access to these things, unless you understand how to buy them, unless you understand how to specify them, you know, all these things, you can't build one, even if you want to, in that sense, right? This is an example. Whereas frozen fish is actually not that difficult, right, as such. Takes a while. So, here are some issues around the electronics industry that we discussed previously that follows from this. No? So you have a number of major players. You see they're all non-Vietnamese. So again, you are not the controllers of the decisions, right? It says that it makes up about 25% of your total export in 2014, right? So it's a big chunk of the economy as such. And it contributes about the same amount just below to the GDP, so it's very important for your prosperity as a country. It is one of these industries that are facing a disruption in terms of how things are made, right? So you have the whole automation area where you are aware that Foxconn, China, is getting rid of all its employees, and replacing them with automation. And that's a lot of people. There's about 1 million people being laid off from Foxconn. And if you want jobs, that means that's not the industry to be in, right? It's exposed to additive manufacturing, to printed electronics, a number of those areas. The opportunities are the driver of the demand. So the whole digitalization issue, specifically Internet of Things, will drive a huge demand for electronic components of different things. So the market will grow around these things, at least specifics of them, which is a good thing. And the whole consumer goods area, where we all have more and more gadgets with electronics in it, will also drive demand. So the end market is growing. That's good news. The threats we have is, if we migrate in with those disruptors into new ways of producing these things, firstly, you're going to have fewer employees. Secondly, there will be a skill mismatch, because the people who presently do those jobs may not be able to do whatever jobs remain in a new production environment. So the question you have to ask on a policy level is, how are we going to ensure either that we remain a desirable location for these people and that their growth exceeds the productivity improvement that the new technology enables, so that the number of employees remain the same or higher? So what can we do as a government to ensure that? That's the key policy question in that environment. Because if we don't, then we're going to have a risk on both that they don't stay, and if they stay, that they won't hire a lot of people, and that becomes a problem for us as an economy. Textiles. You are fantastic in textiles. No, you are a major player in anything from footwear to a number of other areas. You've done very, very well in that industry. Again, it's very important to your export value. It's about 40% of this area. Likewise, like everything else, it has disruptions, opportunities, and threat. Again, it's a digitalization of issues like anything from customization, the ability to have, to produce your own product for a given use and a given person with a given body shape. It's one of those things, yeah. So that's something that's going to happen, and that's going to change the way you do things. All kinds of issues about building in technology in these issues that links to the development in healthcare. Preventive and predictive healthcare systems are closely linked to the industry and textile industry. And computerization of the whole process. So a lot of similar things, not as challenging as for the electronics industry, but still it is a challenge for what is traditionally a very low-tech industry in many domains. So you really have to increase labor productivity, quality, and reduce waste in this industry. It's a big issue. And you have to really reflect on raw material shifts. You do know that most sheets in hospitals in Sweden are made of textiles that originate out of wood. Okay? If you buy a tablecloth of IKEA, it's usually a cellulose-based textile. It's not something that comes of cotton or anything like that. So again, how you're linking your activities in the cellulose-based industries to your textile industries in some of those areas. Yeah. How do you work with automation in these type of companies? And if many of them are small, that's going to be a challenge, because there is a capital investment issue around how to do these things. Yeah, there's a lot of other things I'm not going to go through. And the same thing is skill mismatch, the offshoring, you know, and that means there is likely, highly likely to be a reduction in the workforce that is presently engaged in the Vietnamese textile industry. What you have to do is to create new industry that can absorb some of them and to ensure that whatever textile industry is there becomes more competitive. So again, so its growth is higher than the productivity improvement. And that in an industry which has a long tradition of being relatively low tech is sometimes a challenge. It doesn't stop it from being a desirable policy objective in this area. So this is just two examples of industries which are very important to Vietnam and who are facing disruption due to technology shifts. And where, if we do nothing, the outcome is not going to be so good. So, the first policy objective we must have as a country is to economic complexity. Very important. And that means you constantly need to ask the question, how can we increase the value adding of our product that we sell? Can we do something more to our fish rather than freezing it? Can we do something more in terms of adding value to the electronics by having, for example, a very strong R&D on some aspects of that value chain that makes it desirable to have it here? What can we do to add value around the textiles industry? These are critical issues, so you increase complexity. And each item you do that you didn't do before should increase the opportunity of new things that you can do, rather than closing it down. So you need to move towards the center of that complex picture, rather than moving to the edges of the complex picture. Then a few words about manufactured products versus services. This is where we start to get into confusion and frequently misunderstanding. And this has been the case up until the financial crisis in many of the OECD countries, a complete lack of understanding of what these things entail and the interaction between them. The world is producing more physical goods than ever before in its history. Most countries that make things make more things than they have ever done before. And most countries that make things are very prosperous because a product is more complex than a service. Yes, we are moving towards services. There's no argument about that. You know, we are moving towards everything as a service. But there's no contradiction between that and the product. Let me illustrate it with a very simple statement. There is no Internet of Things without things. Right? Okay? Somebody's going to make all those things. And it's more complex to make those things than to make the services around those things. And we're moving to a world where some of the objects we make are digital objects. But that is no difference, right? Sweden is a very large exporter of services. 70+%, about 3/4 of all Swedish service export are linked to products made in Sweden. Without those products, there would be no service export. And these are what's known as professional or business-related services. They are maintenance services, whatever it may be in these areas. They are the most profitable of all service activities. Much more profitable than financial services. They once upon a time had a heyday, and it's not that good any longer. And by the way, financial industry is in front of huge disruptions. As the ex-head of Barclays said on a big conference in Switzerland earlier this year, most banks are facing a Kodak moment. And most of them will be gone because they are not able or willing to embrace the shift in technology and how consumers are operating. And able to means regulatory or competence-wise. Willing means attitude. So you basically want to have financial services as an enabler and oil that greases the wheel for your economy, not as a sector necessarily in its own right. Right. The same goes for classical business services like accounting and similar things. You need it, and if you can export, it's a good thing, but it's primarily an enabler for your other value creation. What you do want for export purposes is business services. You want most of them linked to your products. And otherwise you have tourism, you have transportation activities, all those services, and they are fine. The problem is they don't pay very well for the people working in those sectors. Most jobs in the tourist sector are very low paid part-time jobs. Jobs in the business services sectors are extremely high paid full-time jobs. Big difference. The other reason why everybody says that we're moving to a service is that for the last 30 years, we've had almost zero productivity improvement in service sectors, whereas we had constant productivity improvement in the manufacturing sector, averaging, say, around about 5% per year in the OECD world. That is changing. For the first time, technology tools are enabling dramatic productivity improvement in service sectors. This productivity improvement is increasing, or this productivity improvement is higher than the growth of those sectors. And that means you see a dramatic reduction in the number of people that operate in some sectors. The classical issues is things like law firms or accounting firms. There's almost no bookkeeping left any longer. So the law firms today increase their annual productivity by about 10 to 12%, whilst the demand for their services increased by about 4 or 5%. That means that they reduce the number of employees dramatically. Their back offices are gone. There's nobody left. It's all done by software. So for the first time ever, services are exposed to the same technologically driven productivity improvement as manufacturing has been for a long time. This means we will have more services, but less people involved in it. The only places where you're going to get dramatic growth in employment is in sectors with low productivity improvement. Tourism, healthcare, a few other things like that. This is a big challenge. The second policy objective is technology adoption. And it's primarily, in most of them, digital, but it's not only digital. There is a number of what I might call general purpose technologies or key enabling technologies. They have the following characteristics. One of those technologies impact multiple other sectors at the same time as it creates a sector in its own right. So we talk about digital technology sectors or ICT sectors, but it also impacts everything else. But you have things like the next one that's going to hit most of these areas is biotechnology, which is dramatically changing the production processes for many things. The first sector that have been exposed to this and have gone through and is in the middle of a shift is the pharmaceutical sector. Pharmaceutical used to be about chemical processes related to small molecules. Right? Nowadays, it is about biotechnology processes related to large molecules. This is an enormous shift. And most big pharmaceutical companies have been struggling with that shift because you cannot take 10,000 chemical engineers and make them into biotechnology engineers. That's not possible. Instead, what they've been forced to do is to split the businesses into two. So they manage the chemical side as a mature business, and then they acquire, we've done, a lot of smaller biotech companies that they put together in a big pile, and then grow that slowly in an area with separate people, separate traditions, separate R&D processes, separate development activities. And that is why some of them have done this very well and sometimes very badly. In the chemical domain today, it costs between $5 and $11 billion to go from the start of an R&D project to a successfully approved pharmaceutical 15 years plus later. At the same time, healthcare systems are changing how much they're willing to pay. This is a big pressure on profitability in the traditional pharmaceutical business. Whereas there is an emerging of biotechnology-based businesses with a different production process, much cheaper actually, a different scenario, still the same timeline, but much lower costs. So that's an example of an industry that is changing dramatically. The whole structure of the industry is changing. And not everybody is able to make the switch. At the same time, that switch opens up for new players. So as a country, you need to reflect on what are the technologies that are critical and how are you going to deal with it. So let's take another sector. Let's take the forestry-related value chain. Okay. Great interest to Finland, great interest to Vietnam, right? So when you look at that sector, you should use a sequence of glasses, depending on what you want to do. The first lens you should use is a lens where you ask yourself about how many kilos do I have? So it's a mass lens, all right? And within each of these lenses, you should then ask, what is the maximum value added I can achieve? So in a mass lens, you want to have so many kilos of logs, you want to optimize the takeout from them using modern scanning equipment and thin blades in the sawmills and stuff like that. And then you want to use everything, so you move from that to engineered timbers. So you make the pre-frames and you make material for bridges, and you then use the middle bit, which is soft, to produce cross-laminated timbers that can replace building construction material and make it cheaper, better, more fireproof, and a number of things, and enable you to make construction into a manufacturing business rather than a randomized, low productivity, constantly outsourced business, right? So that's what happens if you have the mass lens. You become really good at high value added product for the construction industry, and you drive a shift in that industry. So I can build a high-rise building in 3 weeks. I don't need to spend months and years doing it, because everything comes pre-fit, much tighter fit that you can do with a concrete, and it fits perfectly in this area and arrives continuously as you would to any factory. Right. The next lens you could choose to have is an energy lens. So you say, how much energy is there in this thing? And that energy you can then extract through some form of a process. It can be a chemical process or biotechnology process. And out of that you can get anything from ethanol to methanol to Fischer-Tropsch. You can have, you know, your diesel activity. You have a big one just come online in Finland in this area about biodiesel. Of course, the problem with that is that you are serving a market, if you go for the transportation fuel, which with the exception of the airplane industry, which the airlines, which have other incentives to go the green area, you are actually competing with a price pressurized industry. You know, given what's changed to energy, there is a demand decline and a supply growth, so you're not going to be very profitable, but you can migrate up to value added in that industry, or you can go down the route of taking it as a raw material for other chemical processes. The third lens you can have when you look at that sector is to say, I will have a chemical lens. I will ask what molecules are there in my trees. And those molecules I can then extract or modify value add to them. So for example, food industry uses a lot of ingredients. Some of those are flavoring, and one of the common flavoring ingredients is vanilla flavoring, so vanillin. There's one Norwegian company that controls 40% of the vanilla flavoring market in the world, called Borregaard. They used to be a company that made paper and pulp. They no longer do that. And in the paper and pulp process, there was a waste product called lignin. Instead, what they do is they convert the lignin to vanilla flavor. So the beginning of the factory looks the same. There's still logs coming in. But what goes out is high value-added food ingredients, making 8 times as much money as they ever did before. And that's because they had a view on the molecules that you can get out of the trees. So you can do all kinds of smart chemical processes. You can make bioplastic. You can get all kinds of stuff out of these things. And the final lens you can use when you look at a tree is the atomic lens. So you can say, okay, how can I modify the atoms in the tree? In other words, you use nanotechnology. So you use nanocellulose composites, for example. And you can do them in a form like cotton wool, so fluff, which is the most sound-absorbing material we can find. So if you put that in a house wall, removing the vibration also, in a house wall next to a motorway, you will not hear any cars inside it. Right? Huge sound insulation practices. It can be used to make a composite material that you can build car of. No? It can be used to a crystalline form that you can put in ice cream, and where the body has to use more energy to break down the crystal of the nano than it gets in terms of the energy from the rest of the ice cream. So you can have a 0-calorie ice cream. That will sell in the US, I can tell you that. So the key issue here is to say that you can see how the lens you use will determine what you see. And then it's around asking yourself, which of these are desirable for us, and which of these do we have the capability to do? And if you then look at the inherent value of a eucalyptus forest or whatever you may have here, and what you do is you take it out, you chop it to small pieces, and you sell it off to China as inputs into their paper and pulp industry. You have to ask yourself, is that the highest value add we can get out of that raw material? And the answer is probably no. Right. The question then is, what policy do you put in place to enable this change to happen? And how do you work with the companies in that sector to enable this as a collaborative approach, where these companies really want to do this and understand why it is doable, at the same time as they can see it will increase their profitability? So these are classical examples. You can take any sector like that and ask similar questions. What is the lens? Where are we now? Where could we be? Where do we want to be? Where are we capable of going? And what is the journey? We can go next one, I think. So, the third policy objective, which links very much to what I said around the services and manufacturing, is that you should have a policy objective to focus on manufacturing and services linked directly or indirectly to the manufacturing. So it's product, service, system approaches. Because if you do that, it doesn't matter where the migration is, you will still control that total value that comes out of that scenario. And that's really, really important. But it does require some competence. And the other issue is to have the capability in these value chains to operate parallel in the cyber-physical divide. So in other words, when you start designing something, you will design it in the digital world by definition, right? And then you will test it in the digital world, and then you will produce it, and the production system will continuously compare its physical reality, which is simulated digital reality, and make modification either side. And when it comes out, the physical part goes off somewhere, the digital one stays with you, and there's still a communication which allows you to do services, remote, you maintain it, you develop it. So you have a parallel system where you create what is known as a digital twin to the original object. And this digital twin enables you to then maintain, support, and keep upgrading the physical object with the associated services that bring along. But you can see that it requires a different approach and a different capability in companies to do these things. And from a complexity standpoint, there is a very clear hierarchy. The highest complexity comes from producing the tools that are needed to produce what is desirable. So in other words, it is higher economic complexity to produce a 3D printer than to be able to use a 3D printer to produce an object. Right? So that is why, if you look at the economic complexity traditionally, the countries with very high economic complexity also have a very high share in the machine tool industry, because that is the traditional tools to be produced. Because it is incredibly complex to produce a tool to be used to produce something else. Right? Most of those machine tools live in a world of non-price competition. And if you want to understand on a national basis what non-price based competition looks like, you should look at Switzerland. It's my favorite country in this type of domains. Most Swiss companies operate in non-price based competition. In other words, they never compete on price. Right? And let me set the scene. Switzerland has around about 8 million people, so it's a small country. It has a larger manufactured goods export than India has. Has a larger trade surplus with China than Australia has ever had. And it's not because they make chocolate, okay? It is because they make things that nobody else can make. And the logic goes as follows. Illustrate in a second what they actually make. When you talk to the CEOs in that country, they more or less all say the following. Every morning I wake up and I ask myself one question. And the question is, will I today, in my plant or any of my plants, make anything that anybody else can make? If the answer is yes, I'm making the wrong thing. Because if they can make it, they can make it cheaper. Okay? Trust me, you don't go to Switzerland for a cheap holiday, okay? There's no such thing. Very expensive country. Right? And if you have this mindset, that means that you constantly strive to cannibalize your own products before anybody else does. So you don't have this, what is a frequent Anglo-Saxon view of, I need to sweat my assets and keep them going. No, 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 no. You invest heavily in new manufacturing processes and manufacturing equipment. You constantly make things that kill off what you already produce. That's the only way you can stay ahead. And I have a great example for you. If you want to buy a machine that operates in the manufacturing space, in what's known as the subtractive manufacturing space, so the traditional one, in titanium, which is a very hard material, there is only one company that makes these things with some performance ratio. It's a Swiss company. And you come to them and say, I would like to buy one of your machines. They will say, tell us how you're going to make more money and be successful because you buy one of these machines from us. And if you can't tell me, I'm not going to sell you one. Okay? In other words, they flip-side it. And since they make the best machine by far, people respond. So they come with this great case about why they should allow to buy one. How much do you think price negotiations follow from that? The answer is not at all. They are a price maker, not a price taker. Spoken to the CEO, he said in his lifetime, and he's been CEO for 30 years, he's never ever negotiated price, ever. Right? You will have the occasional company that exists in that space. No? You won't have many, but you will have some. All countries have some. They may be local, they may be very good, whatever the taste may be. They may be in the product business, the consumer business. They may be in luxury products. It doesn't really matter. But they are somewhere where you just don't negotiate price. The difference with Switzerland is that most of their industry sit in that space. And part of it is also, if you live in that space, you do it in two ways. You either live it in brand, like Swiss watches and other type of things, all right? Or you sit in a domain where it's technology driven and you lead on technology. And if you're going to lead on technology, you need two things. You need extremely high R&D investment on the company level. And you need very good, trustful collaboration between companies and excellent research institutions, be that in universities or be that in public research institutes. Right. So, let me illustrate that. So assume for a minute that I am I'm a Vietnamese university, okay? Don't know which one, doesn't matter, principal, all right? And I come out and I say to all of you, I have a great idea how we're going to produce the best ice yacht in the world. We have no ice, but let's not worry about that. I believe we can make the best ice yacht. I think there's going to be a lot. We have lots of competence that can be put to use. And in our research and development activities, we are going to develop new things that you can make use of in that area. But I need money from you. So I need you, the companies, to give me money so I can develop this ice yacht and win the World Ice Yacht Competition in Russia or wherever, Canada or somewhere, right? I'm going to win that one, and then we're going to be great. I need $100 million from you. How long would it take for Vietnamese industry to give this university a total of $100 million, do you think? It would never happen, would it? Never. Never. And the never is, they wouldn't believe them, right? They would have no credibility in what they say, and their experiences of working with them would be they don't deliver on time and never what they promise, more or less, right? The Swiss universities said, we have a great idea how we're going to build a yacht that's going to wield America's Cup. We have no ocean, but let's not worry about that, right? We have fantastic belief on the material technologies and the issues around how we can make a superior yacht in this area. But we need money. We need you, all the SME companies, to give us money so we can do that. We need 100 million or so. And if you do, you can have free access to all the IP that we have. How long do you think it took until they got 100 million? The answer is around about 2 weeks. And what did they do? They built a yacht. They had to lift it with a very big helicopter out to the Mediterranean, named the Alighieri. They hired a very good New Zealand crew, and they won America's Cup. So there was trust already before. They always deliver on their promises. And the outcome was excellent for everybody. The material sciences that developed out of this had huge implications for the companies that supported them. It's a totally different attitude. It's an attitude from the universities, and it's an attitude from the companies. And if you are an SME in Switzerland, you work with your universities because you know they deliver what they promise. And the universities are very good. And they understand that they have to be both excellent and relevant, not only one. So if you migrate into this cyber-physics domain, you need to have these type of research institutes who can deliver on what they promise, who are both excellent and who are relevant, and have the ability to work with the size companies that you have and make them successful. Because without that, this is going to be a very, very difficult journey. Take one more and then the fourth policy objective is to have a balanced approach to sector sophistication, right? Not all sectors need to jump from here to there instantaneously. Some needs to go stepwise, some needs to go fast, some needs to jump. So, and also across your economy, you need some sectors that are really sophisticated, and actually you need some that are not. Because you need to have a balance given the skill distribution you have among your citizens. You need to have the ability to make them having a gainful employment. And as a country, you need to have a balance of how you ensure your prosperity and how you move forward as a country. So this is really important. And I will address it in two ways. The first one is that we tend to use two words which actually are fundamentally different, but we frequently use them interchangeable. The two words are innovation and research, right? And I think it's important to understand the distinction between the two. So research is frequently the conversion of money to knowledge. Okay? You spend money and you get new knowledge. Innovation is the other way around, is the conversion of knowledge to money, at least in the private sector, or other socially good if you look at public sector innovations. All right? So research is money to knowledge, innovation is knowledge to value, which is frequently money. And it's really important to understand that if you have research, you don't automatically get innovation. It doesn't happen automatically. There's actually no correlation between the two at all. You can be fantastic at research and useless at innovation. And if you want a statistical national example, a great example is Australia. It's superb at research and really good at really bad at innovation. Right? And that has to do with many things. It has to do with a industry structure, absorptive capacity, incentives, all these kind of issues. So when you need to build good universities or good research institutes, you have to really put down the boundary conditions of what good look like. Huh? So do you want a research university that produces all the great articles in Nature in the world and has no relationship with industry? Is that what you want? You can get that. Right? It's just a matter of what you require and what you put in your boundary conditions when you give them money. Huh? Do you want a research institute that is really good at working with industry but is not on top end of what the knowledge exists? Well, you can get that one too. What you actually want is both. You want something that is excellent in terms of the knowledge it produces, but relevant in terms of how it's able to assist the transformation of that knowledge into value creation activities in other locations. And also, look, I link to universities, so I can say a few things. universities are less important than people think for the innovations in a country. For most, of all innovation that takes place in the private sector, around 5% originates out of linkages with universities. 95 do not. Actually, more important than universities are applied research institutes, public research organizations. They are much more important. And they exist quite a lot in Europe. There's about 900 plus in Europe, very specialized, either nationally and so on. The most famous one is frequently Fraunhofer Institute. These are applied research institute. Their role is to take knowledge, maybe modify it a bit, and then make sure that industry gets use out of it. Korea's got KAIST, a few other things like that. Excellent, right? Very important. And the role that plays in Korean development in terms of supporting industry is not to be underestimated. So public research institutes are critical. They're also incredibly difficult to manage, right? Because if you think about it, if I try to visualize in your mind, given this question, a graph, okay? So on the x-axis, you have a timeline. It goes from today, tomorrow, sometime into the future, right? And on the y-axis, I have how much effort I put in, right? Be that money or time or whatever it is. And if you look at the world from a small company, an SME, most of the effort will be about problems that I need to solve today. That's where they're going to be working. And a little tiny bit about tomorrow, but almost nothing about the future. A university is the reverse. All the research effort they put in is about sometime far into the future. A little bit about tomorrow and nothing about today. Which means if you ask an SME to work with a university, with the exception of Switzerland, you're generally going to fail. Because they have nothing in common. They don't deal with the same issues. And I can illustrate that. I have a lot of university groups coming to me frequently in my different roles and say, we'd like you to support this or give us money for that or whatever it is. And I had this fantastic group who came to me and said, to illustrate the problem, we have developed this brilliant way of using supercritical water to extract some great chemicals out of cellulose, right? So this is, 400 bar, 300 centigrade type water, so supercritical. And they said, and we want the money to build a really big plant. We're now going to make lots of money out of this. And they said, okay. I said, how much are you going to produce? So they gave me a large number. And I said, okay. And your production process is going to be the same, because they had produced a small sphere in the laboratory in which they used this. Yeah, they say we're going to make a bigger sphere. Okay, I said, so I make a back of envelope calculation. I said, that means that your sphere is going to be about 8 meters diameter. They said, yeah, that's probably about right. So I said, so you're going to have an 8-meter diameter sphere with a 400 bar pressure. What material are you going to make that out of? And they looked at me and said, what do you mean? I said, well, in my mind, there's only one material that can handle that, and that's titanium. And if you make this out of titanium, your business case is not going to work, because you will never make any money. It's going to be far too expensive for you. They hadn't even thought about that problem. And this is the illustration of university working on very low technology readiness levels, industry working on high technology readiness levels. And the transition is really complicated. And there are about 9 scales on the technology readiness level scale. And each step you go up costs about 10 times as much as the previous one. which is why when you have a patent in university, you think it's very valuable. But industry look at it and says, no, it's not valuable at all, because the cost we have of putting that into the real level is going to offset any value it holds. So who bridges the middle? Applied research institutes. That's when you have the kind of the things, the Korean ones. You have the Finnish VTT, you have the Swedish RISE, the Australian CSRO. You have all these type of organizations whose task it is to sit in that middle. And in them, you need to have expertise around the industries that matter to your company. So, for example, VTT in Finland has huge expertise in the forestry-based industries, because they are critical for the Finnish economy. So when you have one of your public research organizations that you either have, will establish, or will develop, it needs to be really good in that middle bit where it works about problems that need to be solved tomorrow, not about the future, and not about today, but tomorrow. And they are really experts of taking the world-leading knowledge wherever it sits and converting that is commercially valuable for a company. Something a company couldn't do for itself. And its target audience is primarily SMEs, because the big companies can take care of themselves. And if you work with big companies, you work at a profit margin that you use to cross-subsidize the expensive cost of working with a small company. So there's a lot of issues around how to manage these type of organizations. And you need to put in place this innovation system, and we're going to talk about that a bit later on. So, one of Vietnam's challenges is productivity. And here I would like, before I go into a graph, to say that there are two definitions of productivity. One is the neoclassical economic definition, which is more for less, right? The other one is the one that exists in the evolutionary institutional space, which is smarter things in smarter ways. Both of them are productivity improvement. They are completely different. So if you look at the productivity here in, this is labor productivity in dollar level across the region, the latest numbers I could get my hands on. They are 5 years out of date, so I accept that, but it gives you an indication. And what I want you specifically to focus on is Thailand, on the green bars, okay? The green bars is manufacturing generally. And you can see the fundamental difference between labor productivity of, for example, Thailand and Vietnam. Now, assume that I am a car manufacturer and I'm going to establish a plant in ASEAN where labor, for some reason, matters in my manufacturing. Where will I put it? I will put it in Thailand. One of the key reasons why the Thai policies for a long time has been focusing on productivity improvement has been to lay the groundwork for Thailand's ability to become the manufacturing hub of the ASEAN world. And you have to give them credit. They have been very successful. All right? And it hasn't happened by accident. They've had, and if you go and read their policy plans for the last 10 years, you can see it's been fairly continuously focusing on driving up productivity so that productivity offsets any cost increase that comes with prosperity. And then enabling them to do a few other things like special regions and areas and stuff like that. And as a consequence, they've been very, very successful in attracting manufacturing business. But even in the domain where you are very good, the coverage you have, which is textiles, you can see that your labor productivity is still low. And that's a big challenge. Here's a great slide, one of those 7 dots on a slide. The key thing is to understand what is it that drives productivity? What are the key things that make productivity go up, right? And there are numerous things. The first one is, how good is your management, right? So management matters. If you increase management skills by about, say, 1/6 on average, then it is equivalent to increasing the available labor force for that company by 25%, or increasing the available working capital by 65%. And that means good management matters. It really matters very well. And there are numerous studies of where managers sit and their level of performance on different countries and different sectors. And the bottom line of that is, of course, that the normal countries that do well have good managers. The question then to raise is, how do you become a good manager? That's the interesting question. Where do you learn? How do you learn to become a good manager? And again, I have good and bad news for you. You don't learn how to become a good manager by going and taking an MBA. Sorry, but you don't. What you learn in MBA is to learn the language of good management, which is a different thing, right? You learn to become a good manager by working in a large multinational company exposed to high competition, where you prove that you can make the right decisions to have good outcomes. And you do that because you sit in a system that enables you to pick up those skills. So you're going to work in a Siemens, or you're going to work in a Boeing, or you're going to work in, a BAE Systems or whatever. You work somewhere, a large multinational company on a global market exposed to high competition. You get promoted in that system, which shows that you do well. And normally you get to the level where you run a very small independent operation somewhere. Once you left that, you can take any role. Then you are a good manager. And that means that countries with a high presence of global multinationals in their country, who take on local people and promote them globally, will generate for you a cadre of really good managers. And if you don't have those, you have a challenge. Right? And this is the system that de facto Singapore government has emulated since a long time back, of how they create the people who work in the public sector. Pick the brightest, put them on a path, send them to good education, force them to do things in the private sector, force them to do things in the public sector, and then generate a good group of people for public sector decision making. They've emulated what happens in the private sector in that journey. So the first thing is managerial competence is important. The second one is innovation. And innovation, you can do it in two ways. One way is less effective, another way is more effective. You can give people R&D tax credits and grants and so on. That is, generally speaking, with an exception of one domain, not effective at all. Okay? There's actually a reverse correlation between the amount of R&D tax credit given and the amount of business-driven research and development in the country. So the countries with the highest level of BERD, as it's called, are the countries with zero R&D tax credits. Switzerland, Germany, Sweden, Finland, they have the highest level, whereas the one with very high tax credits have very low BERD. There is one domain that differs, that for which this does not hold true. And that's a domain where startup activities require a long period of R&D with cash outflow before there is an inflow. Classic example would that be pharmaceutical biotech type activities. In that area, R&D tax credit, if they are paid in advance, are enabling a more rapid growth of that sector. But that's just one type of sector, and it's a minority of all sectors. Right? The most effective way of driving innovation is public procurement. By asking for something that does not exist, somebody gets paid to innovate. And the most effective program ever in the history of public procurement to drive these things is the American SBIR program, which is superb. It's been around for 40 years under different names. It's evaluated every year. And every year it comes back being the best use of American taxpayers' dollars of all public programs. And very simplistically expressed, what it means is the following. Every federal agency in the US had to put aside a small amount of money out of their procurement budget. Not out of their total budget, out of their procurement budget. It tends to hover at around 2.5%. It varies a little bit by administration, but around about 2.5%. Then they have to put up problems. Problems that, if solved, would increase the ability of that agency to deliver the outcomes they have to deliver. But there is no solution on the market. And then anybody, an individual, a company, can come on with a proposal. And the key issue is it has to be something that doesn't exist. And there has to be a journey to get there. And the proposal I put forward, and included in them, is a plan about if you're successful, how you will grow the company that is a function of these things. And it's evaluated very, it's a complex evaluation, but in practice it boils down to two questions. Number one, if I get this thing from you, will it solve my problem? Number two, do I think you can make it happen? If the answer is yes for those two things, then there is a milestone program. You move forward, you move forward, you move forward, and if it's successful, it goes to big tender at the end, which always we will, because you're the only one with the product. And at the end of the day, if it fails, you just write it off and say, sorry, it didn't work, and off you go. We learned something on both sides. It's extremely successful. For the 40 years it's been in existence under one name or another, it has created more successful companies than the total US venture capital industry. Because you pay for results. Right? That's the key thing. If you don't succeed, there is no money. And you have to develop something that doesn't exist. And it's a small chunk of public procurement. I can strongly recommend that you look at the Vietnamese version of that program to drive innovation. It's a really good program. More and more countries have understood it and put it in place. The first was UK, followed by Holland, Italy. Australia just put it in place this year on a big way. So it is coming along, and everywhere it's been put in place, it works exceedingly well. So that is how I would talk about innovation. Then one has to realize that not all innovation is kind of research-based. Some is learning by doing, using, and interacting with others. It's frequently we talk about design-based innovation activities. So it's a non-science-based innovation, which is very important in many industries. And we have to ensure that we take care of that to drive productivity. Something about having companies having the right size for the sector they operate in. So in many sectors, there's kind of an optimal size. In some sectors, it's impossible to be small. In some sectors, it's very difficult to be large. Right? Classical issues, that is things like medical devices, which is a really good sector for 200 people type companies. Right? It's an optimal. So understanding what size you need to who, and help companies to realize that there is a growth path to whatever size they need in order to become optimally good at that. That drives productivity when you get to the optimal size. Productivity spillovers, these are frequently linked to agglomeration economic benefits. In other words, clusters. So having companies working together in close proximity in areas that are related will have good benefits. They will all learn from each other. That is kind of non-tradable advantage that you get by having close proximity to people and getting those issues out. And actually, they have a measurable impact on the performance of companies. It tends to increase productivity growth on average by 2 percentage points to be part of a cluster as opposed to not be part of a cluster. Competition is a good thing, generally speaking, as long as the competition is one that has a good outcome for the country, as opposed to one that has a good outcome for another country. This is important to distinguish between those two things. So you want your companies to do well. You don't want to help somebody else's companies to do well, on the whole. You know, yes, there is a gray scale, which is most of that, but it's still, there's some fundamental issues. So you want your companies to be exposed to competition so that they become better. You don't necessarily want your companies to be exposed to the wrong type of competition too brutally so they die and the multinational wins. And that's about how you establish the journey of competition. On the whole, it's a good thing, but there is scales to it. I can tell you that neither Ericsson nor Nokia would have existed today if there had been a brutal competition regime in place when they originated. Both of them were created by a very clear collaboration between government and industry and forcing them to develop things that didn't exist and then making sure that they exported that around the world. That was before we had these funny EU rules about what you're allowed to do and not do in this space. Deregulation, smarter regulation. Another key driver of innovation is regulation. And it works like this. Take environmental regulation, for example. You say, on the country level, I believe that most countries over some time will put in a regulation that forces companies to reduce energy efficiency, increase energy efficiency, or whatever it may be. It's something I believe will happen. And I say to myself, if I put that regulation in first, that means I create a cost hurdle for my companies, right? But I give them an advantage in time of overcoming that. So they will, of course, have to overcome that. They will have to innovate to find ways of reducing that cost hurdle. So when other countries impose a similar hurdle, my companies have an advantage because they can now compete in this new world at a cost advantage compared to those companies in those countries where have just been exposed to the hurdle. And that's an opportunity to really be successful. There are two places in the world where this has been really well executed over time. The first is California, which has a long tradition of doing this in everything from automotive industry and stuff like that. That's why we have catalytic converters and other things in cars. They just say, by this year, 3-4 years from now, you have to achieve this performance ratio. If you don't, you can't sell anything in California. And that's worked exceedingly well in many domains, from energy to this area. And the other one is Sweden in the energy space, where it's creating a huge export industry around all kinds of energy improvement activities based on a high regulatory regime, much tougher than anybody else. Very successful. So regulation as a driver of innovation is not to be underestimated, as compared to regulation that imposes an unnecessary cost burden for companies. Two different things. Flexible input markets, that's going to be really critical around the shift in skill that is happening at the moment. I'll give you some numbers. With the introduction of Industry 4.0, or the digitalization of manufacturing industry in Germany, they are forecasted to get rid of about, or rather release back into the workforce, or whatever useful terminology you want to use, about 600,000 blue-collar workers, give or take, in a period up until 2025. And they're going to create jobs for about 900,000 people in the kind of white-collar space in the same industries. So the net effect on a national level is kind of plus 300,000 or so, which is sounds good, okay? So 300,000 more jobs. Now, underneath that, you have two problems. The first one is none of the 600,000 will get any of the 900,000 jobs because they don't have the skills. So you're going to have 600,000 unemployed. The other one is you won't find 900,000 people to fill the 900,000 jobs. That transition is really problematic. And unless you plan for it, so you work around which of these 600,000 can be trained, do I put in the training in advance to make sure they can transition? How do I fill up the training institution with relevant people who have relevant skill to fill the 900,000 jobs? Unless I do that, I have an economy that on paper is doing very well, but will have a disaster as an outcome. Because I have a huge number of unemployed with all the social consequences of that, and I don't have the people to fill the jobs that will generate the wealth to pay for this. So this is a real issue around understanding, and that means you need to have very flexible input markets in terms of how people are allowed to move around, how you deal with it, and how you work this area. And really companies and individuals and government all have responsibilities to ensure that each individual is relevant in tomorrow's world. We spoke about demand, procurement is the key demand. Absorptive capacity, we're going to talk about that this afternoon, so I'm not going to go in too much about it. But as an organization, when new technology comes around, you must be able to take it in and use it. If you have nobody in the company that understands it, it's no use to you. So how do you increase the ability in firms to absorb new knowledge as it comes along? How do you do that? And there are a couple of issues around that, and I cover that more in detail in the afternoon's discussion. The other thing is that all your managers must have a global outlook, and they must have a global business in their mind, but they must operate locally. That's really important. So there is a key issue about having a social responsibility, good corporate citizen in your local domain while still being internationally competitive. And that means for startup companies, they should always start with intent to conquer the world. That's your mindset, right? You may not get there, but you should have that as a mindset. And you should then work with your people and your issues to try to achieve that. And you should go and export as quickly as you can and really be successful at that, but you should always have a local grounding. One of the strengths of the German economy is their, what they call middle-sized business in Mittelstand. They are large. We mustn't forget that. They are between 4,000 and 25,000 people. So they are mid-sized. They are not SMEs, okay? But what they all have in common is a couple of things. Firstly, they are mostly privately held. Okay? They are not listed on the stock exchange. Listing on stock exchange imposes on companies administrative and mental burdens which tend to reduce their ability for long-term success. Okay? Sometimes you have to do it to get capital. There's nothing wrong with it, but you have to be careful about what it means. Don't list too early is the first thing. Secondly, they have very little debt. If you let in a corporate finance academic in German middle-sized companies, they will tear their hair out because they don't optimize the leveraging or anything like that. They actually have zero debt, most of them. And that means they grow slowly but surely. They have a family tradition, most of them. That doesn't mean the family run them. They have professional management, but family sits in the board. And they have very clear objective. They always strive to be number 1, 2, or 3 in a very small niche. Below that, they fail. So they be number 1, 2, or 3 in a global niche, which is very specialized. Most of them are business to business. You never see them, right? They do some funny things that goes into something else. And they are local. They sit in some small town somewhere. And they really contribute to the social life of that town. They create, apprenticeship more than they need to enable that those people have issues. They are contributing to all the local activities. They support the local football team. They do all this type of things. And you find this with these companies. And these type of Mittelstand, they exist in the Germanic world. We have, most of them exist in Germany, followed by Austria, Switzerland, Sweden, Norway, and Finland in that order of decreasing proportion of the share in terms of total companies. And you have the same there. They are, they're brilliant. I met one of these companies in Norway. They make propellers for specialized things, right? Special propellers. Sit in a small town in the middle of nowhere, very successful, highly R&D intensive, have about 8 PhDs employed of a workforce of about 250, very successful in what they do, serve the world from that little place. And they went to the local council and said, we want to contribute to the local town. What do you want? Right? And it turned out that they had a football team, which apparently was very important to this town to have a good football team. So they said, we want the best coach there is. Fine. They got the Manchester United deputy coach and paid for him and to move him to Norway. So he lived and took care of the football team. As a consequence, the football team did much better. The company got loved in the town. That was their social contribution. And the key thing is they did what the issue. They put him on the salary of the company. So that guy is hired by that company. Doesn't do anything in the company, just works for the football team. But it's that issue of a social responsibility in that sense. And they have a finance system that helps them, because when they do need money occasionally, right, they have a local savings banks, which, by the way, the new EU regulation is at risk of killing off. Yeah? The savings bank lend you money because you have a tradition of always paying back. You're an honorable customer. They don't care about your business plan, right? If you haven't been there before, it doesn't matter how good your business plan is, you can't borrow any money. They have a completely different behavioral pattern on these ones. So you need to understand what it means to have global outlook, global business, and local operations. And then I have a list which I'm not necessarily going to go through about what firms must have, you know, all these type of issues. Yeah, we can go next one. So, when somebody says, should we be in this business, you have to have some framework of how to look at that, right? And what you need to look at, okay, what is the attractiveness of this business, you know, what is the size of it, the margin, the growth, does it create a job or jobs, do we have the raw materials, is it strategically important to increase our complexity, a number of those things. And then you must see, can we actually do it? We might be attractive, but we can't do it, there's no use. So what is the maturity level of this industry? You know, is it mature, is it early growth, what is it? What is the level of consolidation? Does it require big firms, so it's still small and unconsolidated? What are the barriers to entry? Are they high or low? You know, do we have the technology R&D capability in the country? Do we have the talent available in the country? Do we have the capability to make things, whatever they be, digital things or physical things? And do we have an appropriate regulatory and legal frameworks? So that is what you say if somebody says to you, we're going to make food ingredients out of wood, okay? You say, all right, will it fit? No, do we have what it takes to be a success out of this? If the answer is no, you can probably forget about it. If the answer is yes, it might be worth doing in that sense. Yeah. Yeah, and then of course, on the level of a minister, a ministry that you are, you know, you are a ministry of something or other, I expect you to know what goes on in your country, right? I expect you to know who are the players, what do they look, what are the knowledge. So I expect you to have good statistics as well as good knowledge of individual key entities within your domain of responsibility. This is a challenge. It really is. One of the things when I first came to Australia, I was asked to come and help. I asked questions like these things, and they told me, no, we don't have that. And I said, well, how do you make policy if you don't know how many companies you have, you don't know what they do, you don't know where they exist? How do you make policy? They say, we make policy based on principles. Yeah, that's a good one, that one, yes. In other words, they belong to what I call the strategy of hope, okay? We do this thing and we hope something good happens, all right? It really tends not to work very well. So you need to have, so one of the good things you need is you need good statistics, but you also need to know who the key players are. You know, so look, I'll take an extreme example. Singapore put in place a new industry policy a couple of years ago. In that scenario, they invited the 1,500 or so key players in Singapore to make this work, you know, from private company heads to universities. 1,490 turns up, right? And the rest send apologies. And there was a presentation with Minister, Economic Development Board head, and blah, 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 blah. Lasted about half a day. And at the end, the question came, are there any questions? And the CEO raises his hand at the end and said, if I understood you correctly, you want me to do A, B, C. And the answer from one of the panel members was, no, we want you to do X, Y, Z. And the person said, thank you for the clarification, and sat down. Okay? So that only happens in. But it's an illustration of an economy which is small enough and competent enough to firstly understand who is who. So if I want something to change, who do I talk to? Secondly, having a culture which means that if you give orders, they take orders. I'm not saying this is good, I'm just illustrating it, all right? So hence, when you do something in Singapore, it happens. In other economies, it happens for different reasons. It happens because you trust the people who say something. Or you decide that you are inherently conservative and logical. So, I mean, I'll give you an example. There are countries where government does not matter, but the country does very well. Switzerland is a classic example. Here's your homework question. Switzerland is a republic. What's the name of the president? If I asked a Swiss audience, I would have had exactly the same answer. Because he or she does not matter. They have no power. They don't take any decisions. And by the way, if you dislike the decisions, you get 100,000 signatures on a piece of paper and you have a referendum. Right? So it's inherently an extremely conservative country with very slow movement forward, and it's built on a network of trust created by when people do their military service. So officers in the military service become CEOs in companies and senior people in the universities. That network of trust drives Switzerland, combined with an understanding of I have to produce things that nobody else produces. Different world. You have your world, whatever that looks like, but you need to know that world, and you need to understand how to make things happen because people agree that it's a really good thing that it happens, whatever that takes. So, one of the things, of course, that you need to think about is what are the things that should be done by government and what are the things that should be done by the private sector? And think about the following way. Singapore created the Economic Development Board. And, you know, they're lucky, they have a lot of money, put it in there. And part of the Economic Development Board is to figure out how to achieve certain outcomes by attracting right things to Singapore. And they use taxpayers' money to do that. You know? And you can, in one way, you can say they've been very successful. In other ways, you can say it hasn't helped the Singaporean industry. Because Singapore's economy is an economy dependent on companies that are not Singaporean. And that's a big challenge for them. But, you know, so what they did. But part of this is this logic about how financially attractive are the things we are going to do, and how strategically relevant are they? And if it's strategically relevant but not financially attractive, it's a government task. So if you're going to create an incredibly successful public research organization to accelerate the growth of the textile industry, that's not a financially attractive proposition, right? It's not going to happen because the market can see how to make money out of it. It actually shouldn't be a for-profit exercise. It should be a not-for-profit exercise. That means it's a government task to make that happen. Whereas if it's a financially attractive, it's a private sector task. And it's a matter of just how to find the private sector players that can make that happen. Next one. Next one will take a while to get up there. So I'm not going to go through this. I'm going to talk a little bit about this in the afternoon on the session, because this is an answer to one of the questions I was asked to answer in that session. But part of it is, how do I activate a value chain opportunity? So how do I move to migrate my cellulose industry from making wood chips to making cross-laminated timber, for example? How do I do that? And the answer is there are a couple of steps that you migrate across to make this happen. And you have them draft here, and I will talk through specifically how you make that happen later on. And this is, it's not easy, and it requires government involvement, but it's absolutely clear that if you're successful, there's a huge impact you can have doing this. Yeah. This I'm going to spend a little bit of time on. National innovation systems, where I talk about what is a national innovation system? How do you get a grip on it? And basically it contains the following 12 components, right? the first bit you look is the people and the culture in the country, so, or the region. So what education level do we have? You know? What is the level of entrepreneurship, creativity that we have? What risk tolerance do we have? What attitudes do we have to science and technology? Right? I mean, I love the fact that in the US they are struggling now. There was a recent study made where basically they asked young people, how important is science and technology for your life? Okay? So what they did is they put down their mobile phone, they turned off the gaming activity on the computer, and on the computer they answered on the web, no, not at all. Right? In other words, they have no understanding. Do you know that in the United States, more young people believe in magic than believe in science and technology? I blame Harry Potter, but that's but it's, you know. But it's extraordinary. That is a beginning of an incredibly bad outcome. So the first thing to work with is these issues about culture, people, attitudes, knowledge. And culture change takes a generation, but it needs continuous work. Right? Very important. So the first bit is the people and the culture. The second bit is education. And so the purpose we have to ask ourselves is, why do we educate people? What's the purpose of education? And there are many purposes, right? Good social citizen, responsible, knowledgeable, whatever you want to do. There are many reasons, but we have to be clear about that. So we then have to ask ourselves, do we have put in place the right system to enable this outcome to happen? I would say, from very limited knowledge, that the reason why Finland performs very well in the PIRSA scores is because the way they deal with educating their teachers and the environment in which they allow those teachers to operate. It's not that Finland has smarter citizens, okay? It is they actually have understood that the core to good education is teachers, because the students are the same across the world. So how do we do with teaching? What is the requirement for a higher degree? I mean, you know, do you actually have, so what type of exams do you give people? Huh? Is it about repeating what's in the book? Or is it about thinking? Huh? 10 years ago, you went to university to learn something that would enable you to get a job and hold on to that. Today, you go to university to learn something that enables you to create your own job. The question is, has university changed? Right? I am lucky. I had a brilliant education in my first degree when I became an engineer. We had 40 hours of teaching and laboratories every week, including Saturdays, by the way, very old. And the exams were very clear. There were 5 questions on each exam, and there were 20 points on each question. And they were starting from very simple, could you repeat something out of the book? The last question was always an unsolved problem at that time, a problem that nobody had managed to solve, Nobel Prize laureate level. And your task was never to solve it. It was to see how far could you go in reasoning towards it. And we had many professors who sat on the Nobel Committee at that place, so it was quite good. And so the issue was to migrate you to, so when you got your grade, you got 2 grades. You got a grade as a total, what you got, did you pass or not pass type thing. But also you get a comment about how good were you at thinking compared to just repeating your knowledge. It was a brilliant system, right? It was excellent, right? How do you do with PhD level issues? How do you do with workforce development? And how do you do with that vet level training? So in other words, the level that create technicians. How do you do that level? How do you work with your primary and secondary education to lay the groundworks for the young people to have the right attitude and the right skills to move into the world of the future? Very important. So that's the second component of a national innovation system. The third one is public and not-for-profit research and development activities that takes place in universities and governments, and in Australia it's this kind of CSRO and defense research and so on, and not-for-profit organizations, and there are private research activities. So how do you do with that? What is the focus on it? How is it financed? How is it funded? What is the outcome? What does good look like in all these areas, and how does it link in to other things? The fourth component is the public good component. What happens in the health and medical issue? So what is our objective with healthcare? Right? Do we aim for a preventive healthcare, a predictive healthcare, a corrective healthcare? Right? Are we looking at maximizing the productivity in healthcare? Are we looking at minimizing the risk in healthcare? What are all the issues around that? How do we set that system up to be conducive to what we want to achieve in prosperity and social well-being? Okay. And by the way, just to make sure that we understand that there is no correlation between political system nor economic benefits and healthcare outcomes. I was in Cuba recently, and Cuba has two successes and one failure, okay? First success is literacy. Phenomenal. 99.7% of the Cuban population reads to a very high standard. So you have to give them a tick in the box for that. The second one is healthcare. They have a phenomenal healthcare system, and they export doctors around the world. Tick in that. I have total failure in economics. Okay, the economy is just complete crap. Okay, in that sense. But it's interesting. So and you look at the healthcare system. They really are. The education is superb, and they have a really good healthcare system because they've chosen to prioritize it. That's all I'm saying. It's nothing about where the system is good or bad, just to illustrate it. Okay. How do we look at environmental issues here? What is the environmental boundary conditions? Do we have strong environmental regulations? Do we have weak environmental regulations? What is the environmental issues we care about? What are the ones we not care about? How do we link that to an economic activity or not linked it to an economic activity? What is the arts and culture sector for us? Is it something we look at as a cost? Is it something we look at as a revenue? Is it something we look as a integrated with other activities? Is it integrating with tourism? Is it integrated with innovation in companies? What do we look at in this area? What do we do in defense and space? And how do we link those issues to the economic activities? Right? What linkages do we have? Do we have good clusters? Do we have excellent technology transfer? Do we have collaborative research between universities and companies? Do we have diffusion of innovations? Do we have a general awareness of what goes on? Do we organize international conferences where key knowledge domains are being put to use and expressed and enabling people locally to be exposed to these things? How good are we at the cluster system, which is very important. I'm going to go forward, but there's a lot of things about clusters. So agglomeration economic is critical in an innovation system. How do we operate with lead customers? A lead customer is somebody who's willing to work with you before you have an offering and be willing to help you to get the offering right because they have a self-interest in deploying that offering. Right. My university time happened to be the same time as Volvo, town that Volvo was located. They had a very interesting policy as a company at that time. They said, if you have an idea or a product or a service that you think might be interesting for us as a company, and it is not something we ask for, okay? Then you come and knock on door number 2, which is the R&D door. You don't go and knock on the procurement door, okay? And you come in with the thing, and we will look at it, right? And we will come out with 3 answers for you. Number 1, it doesn't work, go away, okay? And at least you get some feedback of what the problem is. Number 2, it is really good and we would like to buy that, so now take this letter, go out and turn left and go in the procurement door. Number 3, it works, it's really interesting, but not for us. So here is our proposition for you. You leave this thing with us, and we're not going to use it in production, but we will try to understand all the things around it. And in return, you can use us as a reference when you try to sell this to somebody else. And it's much easier to go to Detroit if you have Volvo as a reference than if you have no one as a reference. And you can see how that was very clever in terms of being a clever company who learned a lot but gave a benefit to the other party in return for that learning. And they were also very willing to be lead customers and work with you on smart things. So you have lead customers here. And by the way, government should always be a lead customer, always, right? And that means you need to deal with which part of procurement should not be procurement, but should be lead customer activities, where there are different requirements than in procurement. How do you look at direct customers in the country? Who are the stakeholders? All this kind of stuff. What are your international linkages? How do you work with international companies, international research institutions, exchange of people, foreign direct investment? How do you work with that? How do you target the companies you want? How do you ensure that they bring in R&D and not only cheap production? All issues like that. IP, you need to have trusted regulations around that. You need to have access to some form of risk finance, at least for startup companies. How are you going to work with that? You need to have some form of rewards and incentives to do things for people, and then you need to have all kinds of government policy issues. So when you look at the national innovation system, it's made up of all these things. And nowhere does it work perfectly. Okay? By definition, it cannot. It's a dynamic world where everything changes all the time. So it works more or less well, right? In some countries it works reasonably well. No, Germany is one of those at the moment. In some countries it doesn't work so well, right? So the key issue is to figure out how you can try to improve whatever component needs improving the most in this system. That's very important. Something happening? Ah, there we go. It just takes a while. No, there should be one back. There should be a picture on that one. Something funny has happened there. All right, in which case I can talk about it anyway. All right. There should be a picture on this picture. So if you look at this, what are the policy tools you have? They fall into three domains. There are supply-side tools, there are information tools, and there are demand-side tools. Supply-side tools, that include things like, you have it on the picture, it's grants, it's tax credits, it's all this kind of stuff. So what the purpose of that is to ensure there is a supply of whatever you want. Supply of good labor, supply of R&D outcomes, whatever it is that you want to do. So supply issues is one. And traditionally, these are the areas where most governments, not all, most of the time, not all of the time, had put most of their focus. It's on the supply side. And what we have to keep in mind with supply side is that supply side tool drives activity. They don't drive outcome. Okay? Because you get money to do something, not to deliver something, right? So I give you money to do R&D. I don't give you money for successful R&D, right? It's a big difference with these things. So supply-side tool drives activity. They don't drive outcome. Sometimes activity delivers outcome, but not all the time. Then you have information issues. Government has money. No matter how small the government is, it has money as compared to a very small company, right? So if I am in the food business, right, and there is 1,000 small companies who have very little money, none of them can individually afford to buy a very expensive, very detailed market research report around the development of frozen fish demand in wherever, in this area. They can't afford to get that. A report will cost $5,000, $10,000, maybe $1 million, depending how detailed it is. Government can afford to buy that report and then redistribute the money with an agreement with the supplier, which they normally accept, for each company paying $100, and hence getting their money back that way. So it acts as an aggregator and information distributor in this area. Thank you. So you have that. So the information and brokering support is frequently underestimated. It's a really important role that government can play, because it enables companies to get access to information they otherwise would not have had. And it enables those companies to have a better basis on which to make decisions, so they make better informed decisions. It's a really important role, specifically in sectors that are young, immature, or made up of very small companies. Network issues, it's support for it should be hubs rather than dubs, but that's all right. Foresighting studies, in other words, understanding what is going to happen in a technology domain over the coming 5 to 10 years. What are going to be the market drivers for things? What are going to be the technology push issues? And when can we then expect certain things to mature? So that again, I as a company can make a decision on this. So technology foresighting and road mapping activities are actually very, very important for companies around this area. And then demand side. And demand side are the most effective tools. They are the ones that deliver an outcome. And they include things like regulation, procurement, and some systemic policies around clusters. So on the whole, you should have a portfolio of all these things. But if you compare what's happening in the world, there's a migration of emphasis from supply side towards the demand side. So the demand side is becoming more important in most countries' policy portfolio because it is the outcome you ask, whereas the other one doesn't. So this is a great slide. The only thing you need to worry about is the yellow bits. So as a government, you have certain responsibilities in achieving these things. Generally. The first thing is consistent and predictable policy environment. A company, a general company, will only invest if it can have some gut feel for how the world's going to look 5 to 10 years into the future. Because that's the return on investment horizon for major investments. And if you are an unpredictable government, they are not going to invest here. There are other places where they would invest instead. So if you're looking to attract international players, the predictability doesn't mean the policies are the same. That's not the point. But it's predictable. And you're predictable either because you do things that people foresee that you will do because it's on the line, or because you give fair warning. So you say, by 2020, here are the rules that will then be valid. So people understand what it takes and can adapt. Unpredictability is just the worst thing ever. Right? So if you ask large multinational companies, what is worst, unpredictability or high costs? Or basically anything else, they will say unpredictability is worse than anything else. Everything else we can deal with, unpredictability from government, we cannot. And hence, we don't invest there. Very important. You have to have policies that are globally competitive and which do not create any competitive disadvantage for your business. So there are, the policies fall into it. One is the principle of do no harm. That's very important in policy making. Do no harm. Right? So don't put in place anything that would harm anybody in the system. The other one is you have to be competitive. Right? And you see that in Europe at the moment, what's happened over the last 5-10 years around corporate tax rates, right? So somebody started, I think the first one was Estonia, if I remember correctly, down corporate tax rate. Small country, nobody cares. And then it started to migrate, and then, so corporate tax rate has generally in Europe migrated down from around 30% to around 20%. Because if somebody do it, the other people cannot afford not to do it. So you have to stay competitive in this domain. Very important. And the countries who don't do that will see a slow erosion of all foreign controlled industrial activities that do not have a strong strategic reason to stay. So the footloose one will go. Policies should be based on a meaningful dialogue and collaboration between business leaders and policy makers. And that's very important, a key word in that one. The first one is meaningful, right? So you only have to talk, you can only talk to people who have something to contribute to it. The other one is a dialogue. You do have to listen. It's a give and take about what it means and these things. And it's between the, look at business leaders as in this case representing the key domain. If it was in healthcare, it would be areas. But it's around, you know, who are the people out there who you need to talk to because they matter in this and they have something to say. And that means fields when the policy is developed, it is clear that people feel that it has been developed in consultation, and that means it gets accepted. You have to have policies to create institutional legitimacy. In other words, people have to trust your institutional system as a consequence of the policies you put in place. After predictability, the most important thing is energy cost. You have to have a world where energy cost is predictable and low enough to make it meaningful to drive operations. And there is no contradiction if you think through it beforehand between environmentally friendly sources of energy and non-environmentally friendly, the removal is. So you can go to a renewable energy environment and make energy prices low as long as you plan for the systemic implication of the shift. Because what you're going to have as a consequence is a higher component of intermittent energy sources in a system that was designed for continuous energy provision. And this requires you to think through. That means you need to think through both the supply side in the energy system and the demand side in order how to manage both, and the regulatory environment to make this working. And to take an old energy system that was based on purely continuous energy with a focus on supply side and move it to a modern world. If you want to see not how to do it, you're going to look at South Australia. It went from one of the cheapest energy prices in the world to one of the most expensive energy prices in the world over 12 months, with huge blackouts, complete unpredictability and access to power, because they put in too much wind and too much solar in a regulatory system that was built around continuity in a privatized environment. This meant that since they subsidized the intermittent renewable resources, the marginal cost of production is zero. And in a market that is built on bidding, you first buy the cheap ones. That means that the privatized big providers who did continuous energy couldn't sell any of theirs. And since their business model was based on having some load factor, the load factor dropped down between profitability and they closed down. Which means you now only have intermittent energy. And when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, you have no energy. And that is not good if you run a company in this area. And it has nothing to do with technology. All the technology is there to solve this. It's not an issue. It's just that nobody thought it through before the political decisions. It's a classic example of a systemic policy area that requires careful thinking through before you implement anything. And if you do that, it can be very successful. If you don't, it will be disaster. And in the energy domain, this is critical. It's really critical. And of course, you need an education policy that delivers all the STEM people, and you need, long-term support of activities and continuity. Yeah. Yeah. I will say a few words if you flip through that a little bit. Go back a bit. That one. Yeah. I will finish with a few words on what happens in an economy when it digitalizes. There are three shifts that happens out there at the moment as we speak. It is a routine-biased technological change, skill-biased technological change, and capital-biased technological change. Routine-biased technological change means that anything that can be routinized will be automated. When it will happen is a financial decision, but technologically it will be. Now, we're not talking jobs here, we're talking tasks, okay? So each job is made up of many tasks. But as a given task can be routinized, it can be automated. That means that you will have many jobs with a fewer tasks than they used to have in that area. So the average managerial task contains, the average managerial job contains about 20% of tasks that can be routinized and hence can be automated. That means you have about 100 managers yesterday, you have now 100 tomorrow, and you have two choices. You either get rid of 20, so you synthesize these together, so you have 20 unemployed manager and 80 that are 100% employed, or you fill their space with other tasks that cannot be routinized and keep 100. Second issue is skill-biased technological change, and that's what I said before. There are any skill that relates to knowledge only is going to be automated because knowledge is accessible straight away. So the only jobs that will remain are those that require three principal domains of skill or knowledge. One is deep domain knowledge. You need to understand the knowledge in your area. You need to have interpersonal skills. And you need to have creative problem-solving ability. That means I got a problem, you have a tentative solution now, not that you come back with one in 3 months' time. That's what it means. And you find those skill requirements in two ends of the scale. You find it in the top end of the scale, you know, really skilled high-level people, barristers arguing in front of the court, they need all three skills. The bottom end is the person working at a aged care facility or something. They also need the same skill. It's the people in the middle that are gone. This is where we see the polarization of the workforce. Anybody with a back office job is gone. They may not know it yet, but they are. Because that's what happens. That's why we see the segregation of employment. And the final one is capital-biased technological shift. In other words, my investment in an IT system has a higher return than my investment in a person. That means I don't want people. Okay? So I move to a situation with everything as a service. And that means, and the specific thing of that is I move to human as a service. So what that means is that I look at my organization and I will change it. So what I will have is some very few people who are actually higher. They have all those three skills and they are in domain that are critical to my business. Then I have all the other things I need to do in my business, but it's not critical to me. I insource people into those. They are employed by somebody else, and I just get an invoice once a month and pay for it, right? And it's the lowest cost that matters to me. Then I have some people whose expertise I require now and then, but not all the time. And they I have agreement with as individuals, so I pay for them when I need them. Right? And they usually charge a lot, but it's still cheaper for me than to have them continuously on board. And finally, I have all those tasks which needs to be done, which don't matter to me, which are very clear to specify. So standard of work type tasks. Them I put out on a platform like Amazon Mechanical Turk. And I have the lowest bidder do the job for me. About 25% of all employees in the OECD world is now working primarily via those type of platforms. Varying from a lower number in countries like Scandinavia with high employment security to higher number in places like the US, right, in this area. But what one have to realize is that if you go via a platform, you will make very little money. because you're competing globally, you know, and somebody somewhere else will be cheaper than you are. So before I walked in here this morning, I looked at some prices at Amazon Mechanical Turk. So to translate a film, a promotional video of a product that lasts 8 minutes from French to English, you now pay $1.20. And it's done by somebody who sits somewhere, I think in this case, in Myanmar. Okay? I looked at what this means in certain sectors. So, for example, in architecture, there is a lot of work that used to be done, architecture, necessary work, very standard issues. You used to have a young architect do it, newly employed. Not happening any longer. You put it out on a platform, and there is a specialized platform that does this, or that deals with these architectural issues. So if I look at the average project duration, how many hours it takes them to do it, if I assume they get every project continuously with no time, no time to sell or anything, it just goes stop off from one project to another. I assume they work 220 days a year. I assume they are paid the median, which is higher than the average in these platforms. Then your annual income as a junior architect will be $9,800 a year. If you live in Switzerland, they're probably going to buy you 3 cups of coffee. But if you live in Bangladesh, it's a fantastic income. So this is the new global effect we see here. So the digitalization will create lots of work. It always does. You know, you put a picture on Facebook, somebody somewhere looks at it over a platform, makes it readable and appropriate for the computer and puts it in. The computer doesn't do that, right? So there are hundreds of thousands of jobs created in this new economy. They are just not very well paid. And all the people who lose the jobs in the middle will have real problem finding other jobs. There will be not the skills to go to the higher end, surplus on the lower end, which means even if they get the job, it ain't going to be paid, and the rest is working on a platform with a very temporary set of revenues. This is the biggest social challenge we have seen as countries for a very long time, and it requires 2 things from government. One thing is to really start to think about the policies that needs to be put in place in this world. And the second thing is to start to socialize the constituency, so the citizens, about what this change means and the responsibility they have to make themselves attractive in this new world, because otherwise it will be done to them in the negative sense.